Welcome back to the TLGS 2024 conference. My name is Erin Owens from Sam Houston State University, and I'll be moderating today's next presentation. I'm going to turn it over to our presenters who will discuss making scholarly publishing work for you, empowering graduate students to understand the scholarly publishing ecosystem through a Graduate Academy seminar.
Thank you so much to the organizers of this conference. From Duke University Library's ScholarWorks team, we're delighted to be here. There are 5 of us who are part of the core team at Duke University, and we'll just introduce ourselves briefly in order. Hayley?
Good afternoon. I almost said good morning. My name is Hayley Walton. I'm the librarian for education and open scholarship within the Research and Public Services Department, and I am a direct affiliate with the ScholarWorks Center.
And I'm Liz Milewicz, director of the ScholarWorks Center. I'm in the Division of Digital Strategies and Technology at Duke Libraries.
Hey everyone, I'm Will Shaw. I am the Digital Humanities Consultant. I work in the ScholarWorks Center for Open Scholarship.
Hi, my name is Paolo Mangiafico. I'm a scholarly communication strategist in Duke Libraries and ScholarWorks.
And my name is Kate Dickson. I'm the copyright librarian, and I'm in research and public services.
So we will be presenting on this Graduate Academy course. And first, we'd like to give you a little bit of context about this course and our university setting. Paolo.
Yeah, so oops, I'm going to advance my own slide notes here. Yeah, so the next slide, please, Liz. Thank you. So the course we're going to talk about today was titled Navigating Scholarly Publishing, and it was part of the Duke Graduate Academy, which was offered as a partnership between Duke Learning Innovation and Lifetime Education and Duke's Office of Interdisciplinary Studies, and you can see a little bit about that on the screen there. So it's made up of short courses offered during the summer to introduce Duke graduate and professional students and postdoc fellows to skills, tools, and knowledge that augment their regular coursework and research. And so on the screen now you see a list of some of the courses that are going to be offered this year, including this one we're talking about, which we're going to offer again this summer. And yeah, next slide. Thank you. So the short courses are intended to help emerging scholars prepare for high-level research, innovative teaching, leadership, and or public engagement, and all active doctoral masters and professional students and postdocs can participate. And there are no prerequisites for any of these courses. So the sessions meet for 1 or 2 weeks. Ours was 1 week long, met for about 90 minutes each afternoon over 5 days. And all the sessions were on Zoom. And Liz is going to talk more about the details of all this later in the presentation, but there were 19 students enrolled. One withdrew early on, so basically 18 participated, and Liz will talk more about that in a minute. So our course was titled Navigating Scholarly Publishing, and the goal was to give grad students a kind of behind-the-scenes understanding of how scholarly publishing really works. So not just the parts that they're likely to encounter when they get ready to publish, but the broader context. So like, what is scholarly publishing like as a business? What is the political economy of scholarly publishing? What are the legal issues involved, like copyright or contract law or fair use? What role do scholarly societies play? What role do libraries play? How is technology changing the way we do research and teaching and publishing? How are trends in the broader society and economy affecting the academy and academic publishing? How are emerging technologies like artificial intelligence going to affect all of this? What are incentives and rewards in academia and publishing, and how do they affect how all of this works and the decisions that they as researchers and authors make? And then, what ethical questions come into play as they make choices about where and how to publish, and more broadly about how to conduct their research and teaching. So in general, what are things that they should know about and keep in mind as they embark on their careers as researchers and authors, so they can make choices that align with their goals and value and advance equity and broader engagement. So the big thing that we want them to take away from all of this is that they have agency in all of this. So we found that a lot of courses for grad students or early career researchers primarily provide info on how to operate in an environment that's been pre-decided, where the patterns and rules have been set by somebody else, and you just need to learn how to follow them. And while that may be true in some cases, it's a kind of self-defeating proposition. Like there's almost always room for change and improvement, even if it feels like it's small steps. And so and when we're talking about ethical issues, it's imperative for people to try to apply positive change where they can. So we encourage students to go forward using the ecological metaphor of think globally and act locally. To learn and understand the broad context, think about what you can do in your own situation that can benefit both you and your peers and the academy and the world more broadly. We want the students to walk away understanding that they have agency in their careers and how academia works. They may not have much power to affect change as students or early in their careers, but as they progress and become leaders in their fields or peer reviewers and editors in their journals or administrators or just more senior academics, they will have more influence and they should use it to do good. And so, understanding how to do good starts with understanding how things work now, what might already be fine, but especially what could be improved, and then taking action where you can, when you can. In this picture, in case anyone's curious, is an actual building. It's in Milan, Italy. It's called the Bosco Verticale, or the vertical forest, and they've planted all the balconies with trees. So I love this building. So this is why we use the word empowering in our title. So we really see this workshop as not just informing the students, but empowering them to take action. And we want to give them not just things they can learn and understand, but things they can do. So so now a little bit about the content of the course. There are 5 of us on the team that taught this course, and we each took the lead on one day of the course, and the others engaged where they also had expertise to chip in or answering questions or providing Zoom links, in the chat each day. So there were, sorry, I'm going fast, Liz. There were topics. These are the topics for each day of the program, and we're going to briefly go through each of these during this presentation, and then talk more about the structure of the course, the curriculum design, and some of the lessons learned from teaching it. So on the first day of the program, we lay out some of the things that I just talked about for the students, like regarding agency and thinking globally and acting locally, trying to engage them on, hey, this is something you can do, not just learn about. And then we start with a really big picture, like how does scholarly publishing really work? How did we get to where we are now? And so the students have been sent some readings in advance, like this article on the screen, which was in The Guardian in 2017, that gives a really nice overview of the history and the dysfunctional nature of a lot of aspects of scholarly publishing. And the students have started some online discussions in the course site. We were using Sakai in the past. And so we start the session with some of their ideas already in mind and ready for discussion because they've been given some homework in advance. So, as another homework assignment, we've asked them to think about some publishing project that they'd like to do soon, either an upcoming article or a book or a digital project or whatever. And then for each day's topics to think about how these issues might relate to their specific project and their specific goals. And so for this first day, we cover these big picture issues about scholarly publishing, including addressing how copyright, technology, economics, and ethics serve as lenses for understanding different aspects of scholarly publishing. And we encourage the students to think about the interplay of all of these factors. So again, it's an ecosystem, and these things are all connected and interact with each other. All right, I'll hand off to Liz.
All right, thank you. So day 2, should say also at this point, we were really starting to walk students through the process of creating an article. So thinking about their publication as having an audience, how they put together ideas, and then we would work through each day as we go through that publishing life cycle. So when we got to day 2, synthesizing your research typically just is thinking about like, how do I write this and how do I put all these ideas together? We added something to this day that we really wanted students to start being much more aware of, which was to really think about who was the person, who were the communities that they wanted to receive this research article, that they really wanted to connect with this research. And that audience that they have in mind can affect how they might put their ideas together. It might affect even some decisions about, like at the next day that Kate will talk about, some decisions about what kind of rights might be attendant to that research article, whether or not they want people to be able to use it. And even going much further to that last day that will talk about, how might that research work be reused or republished or sustained. So I have to say, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get into the mechanics of the course, but this was a little mind-blowing for a few students. Some of them really struggled with this question of audience. We did give them a tool, one that we adapted from the world of agile software development. We asked them to think about a user story. And in that environment, the user story might say, I am something or other. If I'm this kind of person, I want to do this thing so that I can blank. So it's almost like a Mad Lib for publishing here, or Mad Lib for software development. It says, I am this type of person, and being this type of person, this is the kind of thing I want to be able to do with this type of tool so that I can achieve this other thing that's important to me. We asked them to really think about and use those user stories as a way to kind of force them into this kind of haiku of audience. Who is it that you really think that you want to connect with? How do you think you can connect with them? And what is that motivation for them to connect with this research? In doing this, we hope that they would start thinking more about who needs to access this work? How do they need to access this work? And who might that be that wider audience? And I will pass on the baton to Kate.
Okay, thanks, Liz. So on day 3, we focused on publishing your work. We started out with talking about some basics about copyright and fair use in the public domain. We thought it was really important to kind of ground and frame that understanding of what rights students actually have in their work and how that can inform what they're able to do with it in the publication process. It's also important to the extent they're using any third-party materials in their published work. So we started with those copyright basics. Then we moved on to the related concept of authorship. So we talked about how the law defines an author as the creator of a work, and how, as the author, you really own your copyright unless and until you assign it to another person. Then we talked about joint authorship, the importance of coming to an understanding on joint authorship early on in the writing process. And then we moved on to the concept of authors' rights. So the idea that as an author, you get to decide what rights you're going to keep and what rights you're going to give away. And that the idea that transferring all of your rights without retaining any of them means you're going to need to get that publisher permission to use your own work later, which I think was a little surprising to some of the students. But we also talked about how transferring copyright doesn't have to be all or nothing, and that you really can advocate for retaining rights that that are important to you. So some of those strategies, the most important, of course, is to make sure they're reading their author agreement and asking for changes. We talked through the idea of the author addendum, like the Spark addendum, and then specifically gave them some ideas of clauses in their author agreement that they might want to look out for, ask for clarification and changes where appropriate. So we talked about clauses like governing law and jurisdiction. Is there confidentiality? How can you reuse your work in your IR or for teaching or for future publications? And also what you're agreeing to and with regard to future editions and translations, rights of first refusal, that kind of thing. We also talked about how the fact that you're usually going to be responsible for getting permissions for any third-party materials you're using. So making sure you're paying attention to that part of the author agreement, and really just emphasizing that not all of this stuff is bad, but it is just important to read carefully and be aware of what you're agreeing to. And then we also talked about more generally speaking, how you might evaluate a publisher. So they're probably going to be pretty familiar with the mainstream journals in their fields just by reputation, but they might be approached by a publisher or find one on their own that's maybe a little less well known. So we talked about ways of evaluating a journal's credibility. So like looking at the editorial board and past articles that are published in the journal where it's incorporated, that kind of thing. And we talked about Creative Commons licenses. So paying close attention to how their work will be shared when it is published, who will be able to access that. And that ties kind of back into what Paolo was saying about the ethics. And we also talked a little bit about some ethical issues that come up kind of related to copyright, but not copyright per se. So privacy laws, use and reuse of traditional knowledge or materials about or by individuals from marginalized communities. So that was kind of the copyright and ethics overview. And then we really moved on to discussing how students were encountering these concepts in their own work. And the background reading for this day, actually, I think that Will shared the link there, but it's a really great open educational resource, and it actually has examples of some of these author agreements. So we were able to go through them and show them how they might evaluate some of the better ones and some of the not so good ones. So it was a very helpful kind of hands-on way to wrap things up. So that was day 3. And I guess I'll pass it on to Hayley for day 4.
So on day 4, we talked very specifically about measuring and articulating the value of scholarship. And this is a very difficult concept to sort of both conceptualize and to define. So there are very much traditional metrics within, bibliometrics. We're all really familiar with the H-index or the journal impact factor, all of these kinds of standard quantitative measures of research impact. So in some cases, we really wanted to set this up, not necessarily to operate within the system that already exists. Of course, we're going to educate them about the metrics that currently exist, because in many cases, they're learning about these metrics from their PIs. And those PIs are very beholden to the journal impact factor, and they are very familiar with the journals that are the highest impact in their field. And in many cases, they're not providing any context for why these journals are high impact. And in many cases, they don't understand why the impact factor is generated the way it's generated. So we definitely talked about the system as it exists. We have to acknowledge the way the metrics are and the kind that tenure committees are going to demand. So in many cases, they were familiar with the traditional metrics, not necessarily H-index as much, but definitely the journal impact factor. We had some readings beforehand to sort of problematize why these metrics are challenging and contextualize them so that at least they would come into this day's session with a bit of a greater understanding of what the actual metrics are. We looked at like the metrics toolkit as well as sort of the challenges of a journal impact factor very specifically. One of the things that was really important about this day as well was not only teaching them about operating within the system, but moving with that theme of empowerment. So we wanted to challenge them to think about what they value when it comes to sharing scholarship. So what matters in their discipline? This ties very much into the audience question, right? They have to look at the specific people who are going to be dealing with their articles and what matters to them. So if we are talking about humanists, of course, citations are going to be important, but it's not the same volume of citations that you're looking at if you're looking at medical scientists or hard scientists. So, of course, we're looking at comparing H-indexes across disciplines and comparing journal impact factor across disciplines and why this is an issue. So, of course, any sort of comparative analysis of people beyond a single discipline is going to be extremely problematic. We also talked about the challenges of quantitative measures of impact versus qualitative. Whenever I talk about impact metrics for my students, I always want to emphasize the fact that impact is a story. Of course, some of you have probably heard of that impact story tool that actually allows you to track impact in a different way. But we like to introduce it as something that is really an essential part of showing the value of your scholarship, but aligning that with your own values. So part of the empowerment is to identify those values, right? You need to understand what actually your goals are and how you can disseminate scholarship to meet those goals, but also do it in an equitable way. So of course, we talked about the injustices that are inherent in the system of measuring research impact, especially things like women and people of color are frequently cited less than white men, for example. And yes, Paolo just mentioned citational justice. That's the concept that was coined by an anthropologist, a Black anthropologist, who had encountered the fact that she was not acknowledged in a presentation. Somebody quoted her, but did not cite her work as the part of the presentation. And indeed, even surnames, initials, things like that lead to bias in citational practice. So this came as a big surprise to students. A lot of them see these numbers as sort of objective, and they're not objective, not in the least. Everybody has a bias coming from whatever background you're coming from. And traditionally in academia, people of color and women are underrepresented, which means in many cases they were historically not cited as well, and that trend perpetuates, despite the fact that there are more people of color and women coming into academia at large. So it was really essential to also talk about data collection and privacy. So of course, if you're looking at H indices or journal impact factor, these are coming from big proprietary companies. So Google Scholar, obviously freely accessible if you're looking at an H index. But if you are looking at journal impact factor, or you are looking at H index tracked by either Web of Science or Scopus, those are huge proprietary companies. And we wanted to ensure that people knew what kind of data is sort of being tracked. And it's becoming a greater problem as these big publishing companies acquire more and more aspects of the publishing process and tools. So it's something that we wanted to at least push for them. And of course, AI is going to affect that somehow, though maybe not 100% sure how it's going to do it. But we also wanted them to talk about the norms in their field. And one of the questions we asked was, what are the dominant citation practices? And we need to reword that question because the students came back with like, well, we use APA style. And I was like, okay, well, that's not really the question that we're asking. But we asked them to look at what sort of articles are important to them in their field and how they decide which articles to read, as well as what is most valuable to them. Are the citations more important, or is it actually more important to have your article included in a World Health Organization report? Like that could be much more impactful for a particular scholar. Or is there somebody who wants to be covered in a media outlet instead? So this was a holistic sort of conversation about trying to balance tracking what matters in a qualitative way versus working in the system where things are very, very quantitative. And we're seeing trends. I'm sure some of you, if you're any sort of subject liaison kind of role, you've seen people in the humanities bringing up more of these. How can I generate my H index? Is there a journal impact factor? Which is not necessarily the norm based on disciplines. We'll get to a little bit of feedback later on that the students gave us. Aside from the citational justice thing, one of the things that we notice in this particular day is that it is much more difficult to articulate impact in a large scale way for the humanities and the social sciences if it's not an article-based discipline. So in many cases, we're talking about these very quantitative measures. And while we need to teach them about that, it's not necessarily applicable to some people. So the thing that we had to balance in this session was trying to work on speaking to the humanistic disciplines versus speaking to the sciences and like the medical sciences. Okay, I will pass it along to Will.
Thanks, Hayley. So day 5 of the course. The purpose of this day was largely to reflect on the factors that can make scholarship sustainable, that is, make it reusable, make it durable. And even though this, like positionally, this is at the very end of the course, the idea or the intention was not for it to be a footnote or to suggest that ensuring access and sustainability is something that happens after you do the project. On the contrary, it's built into all the previous steps. And we all know this on some level, but for graduate students, this day is about ensuring that persistence, but it's also a way to amplify what's kind of a leitmotif of the course, that there are steps you can take as graduate students, even as junior scholars, to ensure openness, the quality that facilitates a lot of the good things that we want in scholarship. I directed most of our attention on this day toward digital projects, things that either coexist with conventional monographs and articles, or that maybe just don't fit neatly into the ecosystem that was built for those kinds of research outputs. So a good lens, I think, through which to view these problems is one that discriminates between sustaining and preserving. So like drawing on that distinction for grad students who are new to the whole system turns out to be a useful starting point. And using examples of specific technologies that turned out not to be sustainable, like Adobe Flash, is a way to help make it more concrete. With that said, I don't think it really helps to just like disparage specific platforms or say that, well, it's impossible to sustain things really because they have a lot of technical dependencies. The goal is, or what we need to communicate is that the goal is less like doing things like that and more to point out that even though we are not able to predict the future concretely, we can act as scholars in ways that ensure our scholarship can be accommodated by different futures. So you're not totally powerless, even though things are going to change. And Paolo pointed this out at the beginning. That's kind of the meta takeaway for the course. But the specific takeaways for students on this day need to be twofold, I think. Like, first of all, it's important to decouple the fundamental parts of your scholarship, your digital project, from specific platforms to the greatest extent possible. Digital projects have a whole stack of dependencies, and some of them might involve interchangeable parts. Like maybe the exact database system you're using doesn't really matter, but there's data inside it. And if you can extract it in plain text format, or if you can translate any part of your project into a preservation format like that, then you're going to be in pretty good shape, regardless of how the technology landscape shifts. And the key thing here is that you need to communicate to students that they have the power to do this, like to avoid choosing closed source systems when there are alternatives available, to opt out of, or just like to avoid choosing the proprietary platforms that seem to be easy right now, but come at a high future cost, especially when it comes to sustainability, to openness. So I always phrase this as like try to have an escape route from any platform in any presentational tool. Portability always beats flashiness and bleeding edge tools like every single time. And students need to understand that after this day of the class. Secondly, for kind of a specific takeaway from this day, I think it was important for students to know that technical factors aren't the only ones that affect sustainability and preservation in digital work. They're the ones that are easy to single out and talk about. But it's also important to know that there aren't always things like cataloging workflows for digital projects. And the absence of cataloging affects discovery in obvious ways, which affects the development of a community, which can affect sustainability. That's a big picture logistical factor, but there can be local ones too. Like a lot of times, and students need to understand this as they start a career in academia, a lot of times you are more or less tied to local infrastructure for various reasons and in various ways. Recognizing constraints that affect the long-term viability of your work when it comes to sustaining and preserving it is the first step in figuring out like how to work around them, or how to control for them as well as you can, maybe I should say. So if we can foster in students an understanding that they have some agency about these things, that they can ask questions about the openness of a platform, the portability of their data, like the opacity of their text analysis tool, then this day has been successful, right? We also took some time on this last day of the course to let students comment on or ask questions about any part of the course up to that point. So We wanted to find out what was most useful for students, what they still had questions about. So we budgeted a little more time than usual for reflecting together and less time than usual for talking about course content. We had some really good takeaways from this that I think are going to help us as we think about how to tweak and fine tune things moving forward. And I think that's a good transition point into our next section, where Liz is going to share some details about those takeaways. But before we end up there, we'll talk about some operational basics and the rationale for some of the nuts and bolts behind the course design.
Thank you, everyone, for the content. So we've given you the big picture. We walked you through the course, and I feel like you probably got a sense of what it was like for us, as well as the students going through this 5-day course. The next few slides, I'm going to give you some of those reproducible details. We're going to unpack it all. We're going to show you how we structured this. Of course, if there's anything you have questions about, please drop that into the chat and we'll go into more detail. If you would like to see copies of any of our course materials, we're also glad to share those, especially to get the syllabus. One thing I'll say about the course is that some of the design was somewhat given to us. We were very fortunate to have a group within Duke University who are really interested in providing this kind of instruction for graduate students. So they really set for us that 15 total learner contact hours. So they encouraged us that this is how long this needs to be. This is going to be the uniformity of it. But they gave us a lot of flexibility in terms of how we wanted to stage that, what we wanted that ratio of asynchronous and synchronous content to be. So we divided this up in a way that we felt like would give us momentum for the course, that would also give students enough time between each class meeting to actually do the readings and do the work and then come back and re-engage. We were not required to use anything except Zoom because it was all online. But we also had a course management system here at Duke called Sakai, which we use for delivering the resources for the course. So all of the readings were either linked or uploaded there. And then we had tools, a discussion tool primarily that we used with Sakai. Again, the format of the course was asynchronous and synchronous. So the asynchronous portion would be short exercises and readings that we pre-assigned ahead of a synchronous class session. And all of that asynchronous work, in addition to maybe having an activity like filling out a publication plan or doing a short user story about an audience, and maybe doing some reading, they also always involved posting onto a discussion forum. So partly the goal of that was to help us, and I'll talk a little bit more about this a little further on, getting a sense of what students were taking away. But it also provided another way that students could connect with other students in the course outside of that main class time. But we used the in-class time to really review briefly what they had covered in their readings and in the activities. And then we used any questions or examples that they brought up in the discussion forum or raised in that class itself to really animate the discussion and help drive what we focused on. So, I'm sorry. I don't know if anyone's seeing the same thing I am. I think that the image didn't transfer. So I'll move along to the next slide. Let's see here. Okay, there we go. Apparently there's some animation in there that was a little delayed, but what you have in front of you now, hopefully, is a discussion page that was out of Sakai. And so this gives you an example of what this actually looked like within the course management system. Each day the students would have a post, and then we provided a prompt within each of those posts to give students very specific ways, very specific information to post into the discussion forum. And one of the things that we also really encouraged was read other people's posts. If someone has a question about, in this case, audience or who it is they're trying to reach with their work, and you might have an experience with that, then offer an answer. So I wanted to offer you, wanted to offer you an example of how this looked in the discussion forum. This is just one example where one of the students really engaged with a particular topic. And what happened within that discussion forum was that you had one student who was saying, I think that this article that I'm going to write is going to this particular group. And the student's like, oh yeah, I'm really interested in this topic. Like, who is that audience? Educators, state legislatures, parents, or students? Like, that would have a big difference on messaging, how you might present that idea. And so, they started thinking about, yeah, well, I am thinking about this group, but maybe there's this kind of second level audience members. Who else might be interested in this topic? Kind of reflecting back on earlier in this talk when we were talking about day 2 and audience, and where it really kind of was very challenging for some students, is that within the traditional publishing approach, the focus wasn't necessarily so much on audience as it was on publication, and not so much on the impact I want to have with my research as in the outcome, I want to get it published. And this, starting with that big picture and moving from, all right, who's your audience, and like, what are these ethical considerations, and what is the impact, what do you value and what do you want to measure, and sustaining it for whom? All of these really kind of pushed the center of that publishing conversation to the people who are interacting around this. So I just underscore that as, in these moments on that discussion forum, as this part of this curriculum design, it was really helpful for us to be able to see where were students really starting to make that shift in their thinking. The students themselves, this is the course Grad Academy series of sessions that they offer at Duke are really directed towards any graduate student, which could be master's and PhD, and they have in recent years also allowed postdocs to attend. And instructors' prerogatives, sometimes we've had faculty members who also are interested in these topics. So I just want to highlight, when we say students here, in this case, they were absolutely PhD and masters for this particular course, but there was some latitude. Certainly, they were all going to be advanced in terms of thinking about their subject area. We anticipated a lot of sciences. We did have sciences. We had a lot of humanities graduate students in this course. So we did have an array of interests. Certainly the professional students for these 2-year programs brought another perspective on this. These would be things like the executive MBA, a divinity school, engineering. So they also brought a different perspective to the group. Finally, one of the things that I think is striking about our particular student group that we were working with is that many of them would be classified as in the early stages of their career work or their coursework in their program. So they were either in their first or second year, at least still maybe in coursework, just getting ready to do prelims. So we had really more than half of those students were early in their program. To me, from the experience working with grad students, and be interested in what others have experienced as well, the sooner we can intercede with their thinking around what it is they want to do with their research, who they want to have an impact on, the greater likelihood that by the time they finish their program, they will have made practices and formed relationships and really explored different routes of publishing that will be more beneficial to them. So I'm very optimistic about this particular aspect of this. This is the first year that we've done this course in this particular way, and when we reoffer it, I'll be interested as well to see whether we continue to have these early career students. Finally, assessment. We did assessment pretty regularly. We did assessment internally through the discussion forum, as I mentioned, as a way to kind of check and see how are students understanding, how are they connecting the ideas of the reading with their own project. Within the session, the Zoom session itself, we had a section at the very end, about 15 minutes, that we called Sticky Muddy. And Sticky was, what's sticking for you? Like, what are you really taking away from the session? And then Muddy was like, I'm still kind of confused about this. So we really gave the students time in each session to reflect on, hey, this really means something to me, but also to query us further. Like, I really don't understand how these things are different. Could you explain this some more? We had at the very end of that last session, in fact, as part of the pre-work for day 5, we provided students with a copy of basically a 5 question survey, and we can provide that as well if you're interested. But it was a very simple, like, what are 3 things you're taking away from this? What's the most important thing you're taking away from this? What's something you learned that you really didn't anticipate? What's something you would have liked to spend more time on? Like any kind of feedback you'd like to give us. So we invited the students to share that the last day if they wanted to. Because sometimes if they really had something like, I really want to talk more about this, and they realized they really didn't understand, it would be nice to have that kind of reflection. Or they could just send it to us afterward. So for some of those students, we got that feedback before the end of the course, others after. And then finally, this program itself distributes a questionnaire to all the students who participate in the program. It offers quantitative assessments. How likely are you to retake this course? How much did you learn that you didn't know before from this course, as well as qualitative feedback? What kind of advice would you give the instructors about how to improve their course? So that was also really helpful. That was the only example of a case of getting feedback where we didn't know the student who was providing that feedback. But it gave us all of this together, gave us a really well-rounded sense of how students were responding. So to wrap up, and then we'll move on to questions after this. There are some takeaways that the students had from the course, and we'll share some of those. And then there are things that we learned from doing this course, mainly from the students. They taught us a lot about what was meaningful, but also what was challenging, and also gave us really good feedback about what worked and what could be better. So first of all, we asked the students, what did you learn that you didn't already know? Casting back to, we wanted students to understand the ecosystem. We wanted them to get the big picture. We wanted them to feel empowered, have a sense of agency. I think we nailed that in sense of like getting that content out. There's so many things that we could have put here, and we just put the really short ones to kind of cover a lot of these. We're really impressed that students were coming away with things to think about that they hadn't thought about before, that had not occurred to them. To think about the things that they could do. I really appreciate this one about, I was not aware of the extent of rights I could be signing away. Like, no idea. Oh my goodness. I can ask them to change things. Oh my goodness. So for students to be able to walk out with that sense of agency, like, I can do this. Yeah, that was really exciting for us as instructors. What was your most important takeaway? So of course, this differed for everyone. We just have a couple of examples here. Just even to have a course like this, where they got exposure to lots of different disciplines and lots of different publishing practices, to recognize that there's not a one size fits all, that there is an importance of really understanding what works for your discipline, or what's the norm, but also what really makes sense for the thing that you want to study and work on. I hope it came through with Hayley's talk on day 4, because I felt like I was right back there in day 4 with the students. There was so much response to citational justice that was really encouraging, to know that, especially when you think about a group of students which are mainly early career scholars, early career graduate students, who really are thinking and animated by equity and in collaboration. That was really encouraging. And so that's something that for me, I would be really interested to see, is this something that we might see changing over time? What did you want to learn more about? I mean, there are different ways that we explored this. Sometimes this was like, could we have done a better job explaining this? Or was this really like, hey, we could do an entire course on this, and everybody would sign up. I think that copyright, and this may be something others have experienced at their own institutions. I feel like there's no end to copyright questions. People always, and Kate, I'm sure you'll having done several workshops on this recently beyond this. So many different areas where this continues to come up. And of course, AI is yet a new area where people are asking us questions. We're like, we don't know yet. Let's figure this out. In fact, I do recall that there was someone asking questions about AI in this course last summer, which I feel like, oh yeah, we'll probably have to talk about that this summer as well. And then, you know, kind of these citation impact measures, like what are some of the things that we could do? What are changes that we could be seeing at our institutions? And so that certainly as a center that's really focused on openness and equity, these are questions that are really important to us as well. And so I think these will be things that we continue to think about and cycle into the course. How about us? What did we take away from the feedback and what do we think we're going to do differently? Just to pick one example, I think those disciplinary differences were ones that were tricky to navigate within that space. There's a lot of commonality across these issues, and we certainly try to kind of raise those up so people could see that it's not just about, you know, one discipline, it's done this way and the other one's this way, but to try to help them see that big picture. But we did get some new ideas about how we might explore talking about these issues both within disciplines and then bringing them back together. Would love to hear some thoughts on this as well as when we get to the Q&A. Our last thought before the questions, this was probably really gratifying, and it leads to why we're here today. One of the students, you know, left us with, in fact, this I believe was in the anonymous feedback, so it lands even more deeply and sweetly, is this this reflection that someone really appreciated knowing this, being able to do these kinds of exercises, and being able to get this kind of training. And we actually had another student who was like, I really want to spend all summer publishing and then come back and rejoin the cohort and see what we did at the end of the summer. I was like, all right, like a whole summer course, it's camp now. So we are certainly looking forward to doing this again this coming summer, and we would love to hear your questions and comments on this. So thank you. I will stop sharing so we can see everyone.
All right, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Y'all have questions? Please feel free to put them in the chat.
I'll just mention, in case people didn't see in the chat, that Jill said that she's presenting tomorrow on a very similar course. So watch that presentation, everybody, tomorrow.
Let's see, it looks like Devin asked, were most of these students folks who intended to stay in higher ed? Would you do this course for learners who intended to work outside the academy as clinicians, writers, business people, etc.? And would you change anything for that possible version of the course?
I feel like we can each probably answer part of that. I'll just start and say our goal for the course was that you are connecting with a community that matters for your research. And in some ways, I would say the goal is that we reduce the concern so much about publishing a certain way, but really encourage people to publish in a way that matches what they want to do with their research. So I would say probably, for me, I certainly felt like it matches more some of those individuals who maybe aren't going to the academy, who are really thinking about who's the community that uses this research or who might benefit from this, and how am I getting this to them? But what would others in the group say?
Yeah, I guess I'll say a couple things that are just occurring to me. I mean, one is just the kind of the sense of understand what's going on behind the scenes and don't just accept how it's presented. Like you can make changes and improve things. And so I think that's like just a mindset that's applicable in, in any context, but like encouraging people to feel like they can, kind of thing. And then, for people who are not going into academia, I think in particular, the kind of thinking about your audience one was really important, because I think we kind of all go into, or not, maybe we don't all go into it, but many people go into kind of publishing, assuming that a particular journal or a particular publisher has a particular like readership or whatever, and you're just writing for that readership. But like, you might really want to be reaching public policy people, because the research you're doing is something that should be applied in how society works or whatever. Or you might really want to be reaching K-12 students or things like that. And if so, maybe like a journal is not the right place for you. There's maybe a different venue that will get you that audience better, or a different way of writing or communicating or whatever. And so again, just kind of encouraging people to not think that there's like a path that's on rails and you just have to stick to it, but like thinking about what are your values, what are your goals, and then kind of reflecting on what's the best way to get to that, while doing it ethically and thinking about equity and thinking about all these other issues that are you should be part of any of these like discussions and plans.
Yeah, I think for people leaving academia, I think this course could foster some kind of awareness of what's at stake in academic publishing, and how access to publications is controlled and mediated. And seeing these mechanisms of transferring knowledge can bring a healthy skepticism, or a clear sight into other domains, not just academia. But I think the thing Paolo just highlighted about knowing and understanding your audience is germane, and thinking about my own content from the fifth day of the course, on the hazards of encapsulating whatever it is you're doing in closed or proprietary systems. That's something that's broadly applicable, and it's not like the push to openness and the articulation of the values of openness is not something that is necessarily specific, or is like narrow enough that it would just fit academia.
And from my experience, I deal a lot with questions that are coming in about open access publishing and like APCs and things like that. And we don't have a huge amount of focus on that in this course, which I think for this coming iteration, we might want to insert something about that, because there are so many questions coming in about the issues of funding article processing charges on the author end. So one of the things that is sort of essential, I think, and I totally just lost my train of thought a little bit about where this is going, but to indicate to students that they have that there are resources. There's a challenge, like if they can sort of look for opportunities and things that suit them. And for those who are leaving academia, some people I've seen have left academia because of these trends. So I think one thing that we may be able to do, and this is an opportunity to show them that they don't necessarily have to flee because of the status quo. They may be able to make decisions that would allow them to stay in academia if they so chose. But if not, it's something that's just kind of showing them the norms and the options that they may have, so as not to disillusion them too hard.
Yeah, and I think the copyright and legal stuff kind of can be useful to anyone, whether they're staying in academia or not, just how to read a contract, how to advocate for yourself. So I think that's kind of useful across the board, or I hope so.
There was also a question that's been discussed a little bit in the chat. What do you do about students getting bad advice from their faculty, like embargoing articles that are in the institutional repository? Is there any sort of plan to educate faculty advisors on these similar issues?
I don't think we talked specifically about that in the course, but it's interesting that we did have students talking about advisors. So for instance, on the day talking about audience, one student noted that, well, my PI is just writing for a science journal audience, and I would kind of like this to appeal to this public audience who might also be interested in this. What's the best way that could I get this out? And so it was I think that I like the ideas in the chat. I think that there's a lot to be done to help faculty or other advisors think about other audiences for this work. And I do think we have some partners in this at our university. There's a group called Science and Society on our campus who are specifically focused on how do you get your science understood and communicated to other audiences, either through a blog post or a press release. So there are ways that people can be persuaded that way. But I think about the kinds of workshops. I know you mentioned, Paolo, about doing RCR workshops, or maybe others have done these as well. We do have research town halls where we have opportunities to do kind of a broad training for faculty, my sense is that it's often easier to persuade if it's happening one-on-one or in a smaller group, or if we have someone who can explain the value to others who maybe are less aware of that. So I'll step away from the mic. Maybe you want to talk about that, Paolo.
I'll just add to what you said in that like we take every opportunity we can to talk to faculty, trying to get ourselves invited to department meetings or or if someone contacts us about a particular topic, we'll use that opportunity to engage them on something that's related to that. And Hayley does this like every day when people write in saying, "Hey, can you help me with the $3,000 I want to pay for this APC?" And they'll get back a couple of paragraphs on like how the publishing ecosystem is dysfunctional and like why APCs are bad. And so like don't just try to solve your immediate problem, but understand how it's part of this bigger picture. And so we tend to do that kind of thing a lot. And I put a link in the chat too of there's a different group at Duke called the Office of Scientific Integrity that also does a ton of programming in this area, and we collaborate closely with them on some of it.
Excellent. Devin asks, do you know of other programs like yours?
So I don't know if they're like graduate academy type programs, maybe you all do, but I'm sure that there are courses like this that are being offered all over the place for graduate students. I just don't know if they're just like a 5-day thing or whatever, like this structure.
Definitely seen programs that explain like how to get published. I think one thing I would like to, I hope there are more like this one in terms of the content. We really would like to see more encouraging students to recognize the agency that they have in making some of these decisions about how their research is received and the kind of impact it could have. So if you know of some, we would love to be in touch and compare notes.
Yeah, it sounds like you were very fortunate to have the kind of buy-in to get those 15 course hours. I know at my institution, we offer a lot of this stuff as just optional, bits and pieces, but it's hard to get that institutional support to do all of it.
So I'll mention about the Responsible Conduct of Research program because those are like graduate students are required to take a certain number of those. And the graduate school is always looking for courses that they can offer because so many students need to take it. And the library offers, I want to say like 60 to 80% of the courses offered through that program. And so we have lots of opportunities to get in front of graduate students. And like those are 2-hour sessions. They're not like this week-long thing, but I put a link in the chat of one that I do call the Empowered Author. And I know everybody else here does them also on different topics. And I had 140 people registered for mine a couple of weeks ago. So there's like definitely interest in people come and engage and hopefully, learn something and do something with what they've learned.
Excellent. We're getting some very positive comments in the chat. Excellent program, excellent discussion. Thank you all so much for sharing this. Any final words?
One of the questions in the chat was really good about what intrigued the early graduates in this program. And I don't think we necessarily got any feedback of like, why did we take this? But I think it's a really good question to add to our assessment for this coming session. What intrigued you about this? I hope that in part, this is only speculation, of course, that it was something akin to, navigating. This is complicated, and hopefully empowering also spoke to them. Obviously, it was just called Navigating Scholarly Publishing in the catalog, so maybe that was the thing that really grabbed people because it is a very complicated landscape these days, especially with all the different publishing options and surveillance and copyright and all that kind of stuff. But I hope they were snagged by the empowering part to sort of like in the description, we included that. So, but I think that's a great question for us to ask in our assessment next time.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for presenting and sharing your insights on this with us. Our next session will begin in just about 1 minute.
Thanks so much, Erin and Wendy. I have to step away, but it was such a pleasure.
It was a great session. Thank you very much. And I'm sure you've inspired a lot of us to see what we could do in our own places.
Thanks.